We start in the cold waters of the North Atlantic with the most famous sea monster of all, the Kraken. Norse and Icelandic legends from the 12th century describe a creature so massive that its back, breaking the surface, could be mistaken for an island. Some sailors even claim to have anchored on it, only to be dragged under when the island submerged again. Stories describe long arms rising from the deep to wrap around a ship's hull and drag it under, and violent whirlpools formed as the creature dove back into the depths. Fishermen also believed that wherever the Kraken had recently surfaced, the water would suddenly boil with fish, driven upward by its movement, a danger, but also a tempting opportunity for a brave crew. By the 18th century, a Danish bishop and naturalist was writing about the Kraken in serious natural history texts, treating it as real, if rarely seen, wildlife. Scientists now believe the legend was likely inspired by real encounters with giant squid, which can grow over 40 feet long and were almost never seen alive until one was filmed in the wild in 2004. Before that, fishermen occasionally hauled up strange, sucker-marked wreckage or found enormous, decomposing carcasses washed ashore, with no living animal ever confirmed. The myth wasn't entirely fantasy. It was a real animal, glimpsed rarely and imperfectly, magnified into legend by fear, distance, and centuries of retelling around the fire. From the cold north, we travel to the sunlit Mediterranean, home to the sirens. In early Greek mythology, they weren't fish-tailed beauties. They were part woman, part bird, living on a rocky, flower-covered island surrounded, according to legend, by the bones of sailors who never left. Their weapon wasn't beauty. It was sound. Their voices were said to be so hypnotic, so perfectly tuned to whatever a listener most longed to hear, that sailors would forget to eat, forget to steer, and sail straight onto the rocks. The most famous encounter comes from Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus wants to hear their song and survive, so he orders his crew to plug their ears completely with beeswax, then has himself lashed tightly to the mast, instructing them in advance to ignore any pleas he makes no matter how desperate he sounds. As the ship passes, he strains against the ropes, begging to be freed, but his deaf crew simply rows on. Over the following centuries, the bird woman sirens gradually merged with a completely different tradition from Northern Europe, fish-tailed water spirits, eventually becoming the mermaid we picture today. By the medieval period, artists had almost entirely abandoned the bird imagery, and the once feathered sirens of Homer's world had all but vanished from popular depiction, replaced by a figure with a tail instead of talons. Nearly every seafaring culture has some version of a half-human, half-fish being, and in Europe that became the mermaid. Rather than one unified myth, mermaid folklore varies enormously by region. Mermaids were often treated as omens, some benevolent, warning sailors of coming storms, others malevolent, using beauty and song to lure sailors into the water and drown them, sometimes to steal their souls or drag them down to underwater kingdoms. Mermen appear far less often, but in Celtic and Scandinavian tradition were considered even more dangerous, stirring up storms out of spite. Sightings were reported for centuries as fact, right through early exploration logs. Christopher Columbus reportedly recorded one in 1493, noting the creature was not as pretty as depicted. Most historians believe many sightings were actually manatees or dugongs, seen at a distance by exhausted, homesick sailors who hadn't seen a woman in months and were primed to see one in the water. The most famous modern version, Hans Christian Andersen's 1837 The Little Mermaid, is far darker than most adaptations. The mermaid trades her voice for legs that feel like treading on knives, and the story offers no guaranteed happy ending, reflecting older folk traditions where the sea and human world were never meant to mix peacefully or without cost. Now we return to Greek mythology for one half of the most terrifying nautical challenge ever imagined, Scylla. She was once a beautiful sea nymph, transformed by a jealous rival, sometimes the sorceress Circe, sometimes Poseidon's wife, into a monster after her bathing waters were secretly poisoned. The result was almost impossible to fully picture. 6 long necks, each ending in a head lined with 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth, and 12 tentacle-like legs, all fused permanently to a jagged cliffside overlooking a narrow strait of water. Scylla couldn't chase ships down, and she never needed to. Any vessel that sailed too close to her side of the strait would have crew members snatched directly off the deck, one head grabbing one sailor at a time, faster than anyone aboard could react or defend themselves. Sailors couldn't outrun her, and they certainly couldn't fight her. The only real strategy was avoidance, and even that came at a steep price, since dodging Scylla meant drifting dangerously close to something far worse waiting just across the water. Ancient audiences understood her not as a villain acting out of malice, but as an unavoidable hazard of the sea itself, something to plan around, not defeat, much like a reef or a rocky shoal marked on a modern chart. Directly across the strait from Scylla lived her equally deadly counterpart, Charybdis. Where Scylla was a monster with teeth and grabbing limbs, Charybdis was something stranger, a force of nature given a name, a nymph transformed by Zeus into a permanent, monstrous whirlpool as punishment. 3 times a day, she would swallow enormous volumes of seawater in a single violent gulp, then spew it back out again, creating a churning vortex powerful enough to pull an entire ship down into the depths with no survivors. Together, Scylla and Charybdis created one of mythology's most famous impossible choices: hug the shore near Scylla and accept losing a few crew members, or steer toward the center of the strait and risk losing the entire ship to Charybdis instead. In the Odyssey, Odysseus is explicitly told to sail closer to Scylla, sacrificing a few men deliberately rather than risk everyone at once. This is where the phrase "caught between Scylla and Charybdis" comes from, still used today as shorthand for a situation where every option carries real, unavoidable cost. Historians believe the myth likely grew out of genuinely dangerous, unpredictable currents in Italy's Strait of Messina, a channel ancient sailors would have had to cross on major trade routes.
From narrow straits, we move to something built on an entirely cosmic scale, Leviathan. In the Hebrew Bible, most memorably in the book of Job, Leviathan is described as a primeval sea serpent of almost unimaginable size and power, so vast and dangerous that Scripture states only a divine being could ever hope to capture or control it. The description is vivid even by modern standards, scales like rows of interlocking shields that no weapon can. From narrow straits, we move to something built on an entirely cosmic scale, Leviathan. In the Hebrew Bible, most memorably in the book of Job, Leviathan is described as a primeval sea serpent of almost unimaginable size and power, so vast and dangerous that Scripture states only a divine being could ever hope to capture or control it. The description is vivid even by modern standards, scales like rows of interlocking shields that no weapon can.